Miranda here for 2 months with us from the Institute of Philosophy in Cuba, and he's teaching and torturing our students and doing a lot of things around campus, and have been really looking forward to this night. And before I do just a little bit of an introduction, I think Umberto wanted to say a couple of things.
Just one is to say thanks for some people who made it possible. Starting by the Senator, White House, and his staff who moved the visas and so on. The President and the Provost who has supported my visits here is a third strike, you're out. So I hope that it is for good. Dr. Daniel Bradford from the International Studies Department and the whole department who supported my visit too. Nancy Strickland, my friend, the whole Department of Economics is thinking of me. The Secretary, Kathy Clark, she's the angel who deals with everything. Dr. McIntyre, and particularly Dr. Maureen Mockley, she's not here, but I wish she could be here, and I wish she could see this happening because she's been pushing for that. So thank you all for that.
Great. So I'm going to change the rules of the game just a little bit from what Jill had said. Umberto and I are going to talk about inequality in Cuba, and especially inequality in relationship to the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And we're going to start talking a little bit about what Cuba was like before 1959, what the revolution tried to accomplish, how those accomplishments were affected by the very difficult relationship that Cuba had and still has to a large extent with the United States. And then we're going to stop after about 20, 25 minutes or so and ask for questions from you. And either Sterl or Michael will come around with a microphone. They're fighting over that. Because we would like to interact with you as much as we can tonight. And then after we take some questions and have some back and forth, then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Cuba now, again in relation to inequality, and again partly in relationship to its relationship with the United States. One of the problems in the U.S. is we always think it's all about us, so that the Cuban relationship with the United States is just the most important thing going on. But in fact, the most important thing going on in Cuba is what's going on in Cuba. And the future of Cuba will be decided by Cubans. Shocking, I know. So we do want to talk about the U.S.-Cuban relationship, but not make it the sole focus of what we're doing tonight. We have a range of expertise in the group tonight, the room tonight. I know from people who maybe know a little bit about Cuba from their classes in sociology or politics or economics, to people who've been there, to people who've been there many times. So I don't want to say too much. Cuba's an island.
Yes.
It's the largest island in the Caribbean. It's very long and thin, so it stretches across much of the Caribbean. And as I'm sure you know, 2 years ago, Raul Castro, the president of Cuba, and Barack Obama, the president of the United States, made a simultaneous announcement that the U.S. and Cuba would reestablish diplomatic relations. And this was 1 month before the first URI J-term trip to Cuba. So a lot of people thought that my colleague, Maureen Mockley, along with Umberto and another friend of ours, Miguel Coyula, had caused all this because it happened and then there we were in Cuba. And I'm not denying that that's true. And things are changing between the United States and Cuba, although slowly. And things are changing in Cuba, although maybe not in the way you would think that they are changing. So that's what we want to talk about tonight. So I thought I would start with a question about Cuba before the revolution, before 1959. And if you could talk a little bit about inequality of wealth in Cuba inequality of income in Cuba in the 1940s and 50s and how that related to the revolution.
Okay. One reason why we're having this conversation is that Cubans cannot be brief, so he is containing me. You'll see it's very polite, but it's going to happen. In the 50s, according to all the reports, Cuba had the highest GDP in the area. We were the 5th largest producer of and exporter of sugar cane, nickel, the mineral, coffee, cigars, rum. We were the 5th largest exporter of beef in the world. And the numbers, economic numbers in Cuba were really high. Havana, for example, experienced one of the most amazing urban development in the 50s. The growth was, you see the pictures from one year to the other, and it changed completely. At the same time, the levels of inequality in Cuba were dramatic. According to a report from the Roslow Commission, they developed research in Cuba from 1952 to 1956. They already warned about a revolt in Cuba because of the inequalities. 1% of the Cuban population have had access to beef on a regular basis, means like 3 times a week. 4% of Cuban population had access to milk. The levels of illiteracy were the highest in the area, were almost 58%. Almost 60 children died at birth for every 1,000 people dying for curable diseases. I mean, there was a lot of discontent. And on the bottom line, Fulgencio Batista carried a coup in 1952, and it was against the will of people, and there was a revolt, and a lot of people dying, etc. So, first assumption, by 1958, it was necessary a change in Cuba, and the revolution was an experience to correct the inequality in Cuba. And that was the context in which that happened. In February 1959, the head of the revolution, Fidel Castro, visited the U.S. And he had an interview, like 2 hours, with, at that time, the Vice President Nixon, because Eisenhower didn't want to receive him. And after the interview, right after that, the papers said that Nixon, and I quote him, "This is a dangerous guy. We need to get rid of him as soon as possible." So since the very beginning, there was a hostile relation. And the whole process of the Cuban Revolution happened in the middle of the huge confrontation with the U.S. Even more, economically speaking, the most important sector of the Cuban economy was linked to the imports from the U.S. And right after the revolution, this sector massively emigrated to the U.S. and settled down in Florida, mainly in Florida. When you take a look to reviews and the press of before 1959, in Cuba there were not stores. No one, everyone used to buy stuff directly from the U.S. You used to get a catalog and just make a phone call and forward ferries every day, two from Louisiana, two from Florida, used to bring the stuff you wanted. So there was a huge dependency from the U.S. And at the same time, most of the wealth in few hands and huge disparity at a social level. So the revolution tried to correct that. That was the main cause of the revolution in 1959. And I have a lot of disagreements with the present government, but I'm completely convinced that in my country there was a need of having this violent change in order to correct inequalities, which happened soon enough. The revolution began. For example, part of the program was to eradicate illiteracy. From 1960 to 1961, just 1 year, it took the Cuban government to eradicate illiteracy. And particularly take into account that half of the professionals in Cuba left the island to come to the US. And at the time, the government was asked who was going to carry that. Young people, students were the ones. Young people, 11, 12 years old, real kids, they went to the mountains everywhere to educate people. I heard in one of my classes a student who said that this process of this literacy campaign was a campaign of propaganda and brainwashing, similar to what happened with ISIS in the Middle East and so on. I guess it's far from the truth. I mean, it's difficult that you teach people how to read and write and see for themselves and think for themselves, and then you can brainwash them. Cuba, before 1959, also was the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. Actually, Las Vegas was nothing before 1959 because Cuba was the casino. All the gambling, all the family of Mayor Lansky and all these mob people were settled down. I don't know how many of you have been in Havana, but I'm sure that like 99.99% of Americans visiting Havana go to the Hotel Nacional and drink a mojito watching the coast of the Malecón. The Hotel Nacional used to belong to Mayor Lansky, and it was his place. And Santos Traficante, there were a group of mob guys ruling the whole business in Cuba. The levels of prostitution were really high. There were neighborhoods in Havana built to host prostitutes. In a country of 6.5 million people, and in a city like Havana with 1.5 million people at that time, the statistics says that there were like around 16,500 prostitutes. So it's a huge number of it. So the island was the casino and the place for the brothel for the Marines. Prostitution was eradicated in Cuba in the 60s without a law against women. It was all the contrary. It was providing women opportunities to work, to have dignity, to be independent. And I think Cuba became in the 60s kind of a paradigm in terms of culture, in terms of dignifying human life, in terms of emancipation. Even I was telling Rick this morning, even the Cuban Revolution shift the paradigms for men in fashion. If you look at the fashion at that time, who was the guy? It was Presley. And Presley used to have a very short hair with a lot of Vaseline and shave completely. And suddenly there was this group of handsome guys with long hair, beard, and necklaces and whatever. You cannot understand the hippie movement in the 60s in this country without understanding the influence of the Cuban Revolution and Cuban rebels and the Barbudos. So even at that point, the revolution was a shift in paradigms in the 60s. And at that time, there were three major economic models trying to change everything. One led by Che Guevara, one led by another economist from the socialist backgrounds, and the other one more heterodox by Fidel Castro. 3 of them failed. There was no economic forces to move on. And again, in order to understand what happened in Cuba, we need to understand that the conflict with the US is a domestic actor. It's part of the reality. Every time a Cuban opened his or her eyes. In 1960, Kennedy signed the embargo on Cuba. And I like the part of the, one of my favorite movies, The Matrix. And Morpheus was talking with Neo, showing what happened. He said, we don't know who shoot first. What we know is that the sky right now is burned, and we can't live. There are a lot of versions about who shoot first to trigger the embargo. It's true that by 1959, U.S. had a lot of interest in Cuba, particularly in the sugarcane industry. By the time Fidel Castro visited here, and it was like targeted, things started getting rusty and really hot. First of all, in the middle of the Cold War, a country trying to be independent from the U.S. in the middle of the backyard, with the influence of the communism, in the influence of the McCarthyism in the U.S. But this is another thing we need to understand. This country was under the McCarthyism at that time. And there was a fever, anti-communist fever, and the communist enemy were all over the places. And the Cuban Revolution was seen under that assumption. And at some point, the Cuban Revolution was denying to export sugar to the U.S. It was the major importer of Cuban sugar cane. So they were told, no, we won't buy your sugar anymore. And of course, in the middle of the Cold War, Alexander Mikoyan, representing the Soviet Union, came there and said, well, okay, we can buy you sugar. And it happened. And then the owners of the sugar mills said, we won't refine sugar. We won't produce sugar for you to sell it to the Russians. Okay, we'll take the sugar mills. You're in my territory because we need to survive. Well, we won't send another drop of oil to Cuba. Well, okay. Then the Russians came again and said, we can trade the sugar for oil. And then the Texaco company, who was the one in charge of the oil refineries in Cuba, said, we won't refine any drop of Russian oil. Okay, you are in my territory, so I take it. So there was a process of, it was a tour de force.
So let me just interrupt you there, because there are no short Cuban answers. I understand that. But, so American policy drove Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union. But it seems like it didn't necessarily prevent the Cuban Revolution in the early days from achieving its goals of creating greater equality of education, greater equality of health, greater equality of income. Those all happened.
Yeah, and everything happened in the middle of the worst conditions. I have to say that. When did it happen? The baby boom in the U.S.
46 to 64.
And why was that?
People were happy.
You see? Well, tell you what, in Cuba, the baby boom was in the 60s. And in the middle of the worst confrontation with the U.S. I mean, the missile crisis, it was like we will be erased from the face of the earth. And it was a constant danger. Every day we woke up with the idea that tomorrow they will come. Actually, There is a very good joke, I'll tell you later about that. The danger of Americans coming to Cuba and so on. The thing is, in the middle of that, there was a baby boom in Cuba. It was not because we were healthy, wealthy or happy. It is, well, we need to reproduce ourselves, multiply in order to survive. So in the middle of those conditions, people were really integrated in order to change the order. And this is something I want to remark. The first 10 years of the Cuban Revolution were the most social participatory experience I've ever met. People were making decisions about their lives. And Fidel Castro was a very charismatic guy. Actually, I like to say that he was victim of his own successes because he made it. And he established a very informal kind of communication with the people. And every time there was a tough decision to make, people were consulted and people supported that, or not. And at that time, the leaders of the revolution were people who were accessible, easy going, easy to talk to them. And they could be interrupted in the middle of their work and talk with them and ask for problems. So there was a real communication, and it was a very participatory process, and that's why there were so many achievements at that time. In the middle of the confrontation, in the middle of the poverty, because people who were wealthy in Cuba, they took everything out from the island by the time the revolution triumphed. So we had to deal with ourselves. And it was in the middle of a very, again, participatory process. Everything went pretty much okay in that sense until 1968. And that's another mark in history. Because right now, part of the debate in Cuba had to do with people thinking we need to go back to 1958.
58.
Yes, to 1958. My point is, and I'm trying to prove why, that we need to come back, we need to return to 1968. There was too much influence of Cuban Revolution in the 60s. You know, all the movements and in Mexico, in Europe, in Paris, in 68 was a very emancipatory times. And then also, we know what happened in Prague in 1968. People trying to move to a more democratic socialism and whatever, and then the Russian tanks entering there. 1968, it was a tough moment for the Cuban Revolution because those economic models that they try in order to support the ideas and the changes, the social changes in Cuba, failed. And the only option was to get more aligned with the Russians and the Comecon. And that alignment brought conditions. And then one of the responses to 1968 was to abolish all the small businesses. Try to imagine this shoe repairing guy in your neighborhood. Mostly it's an old guy doing his business, and people go there and repair the shoes. In an overnight, they were converted, turned into honorable member of the National Consolidated Enterprise for Shoe Repairing, which means it disappeared like a dinosaur. I mean, every small business, and it was a failure, not just economically speaking, but also it turned good people into enemies, just for nothing.
So what you're saying then is that rather than going back to 1958, Cuba needs to think about going back to the point where even though the big enterprises and the big plantations have been nationalized, that small business was still privately owned.
Definitely.
And yet, as far as I know, that period when Cuba became closer to the Soviet Union and joined that Comecon, the Eastern European trading bloc, materially in the 70s, things were good.
Yes, very good. But we became very boring. It's true that the economic infrastructure of Cuba experienced tremendous growth. In 1980, we could send a guy to outer space, you know. So it was a sign of a very powerful infrastructure. And the levels of development in education and healthcare and so on, they grew up dramatically. And in less than a decade, from the 70s to the 80s, Cuba reduced the infant mortality rate to below 6. And the mortality rate of mothers was almost 0. I mean, there was a very good healthcare system installed because of the good economic conditions we used to have.
So the economy got better, but the revolution somehow lost its way because this process of consultation stopped, or because freedom of thought was less, or how is it that the revolution lost its way after?
It's a combination. It's a very strange combination because, again, I think it was very boring. And it's boring because, I mean, it lost all the entertainment we used to enjoy before. Like, well, the first bad sign is that the birth rate gets stable. People start getting boring.
Okay.
In order to align with the Comecon, Cuban society started to experience changes. And actually, there is something real. I mean, revolution is a chaos in which you change all the orders and you tear down the previous powers and so on. And you need to build new institutions and new systems in society. The thing is, the way it started being built started getting away from people's opinion. And suddenly there was a group of people who thought that they incarnated the spirit of emancipation, the spirit of revolution, and so on. They started establishing parameters of what means to be a revolutionary, what doesn't mean, and so on. And by 1976, when the new institutional body of Cuba appeared, it was already something getting away from the spirit from the revolution at the beginning.
And yet the gains of the revolution in terms of inequality were maintained. That income inequality didn't grow in that period. Literacy was at extraordinary levels. Healthcare became a model for developing countries around the world, but something became ossified or bureaucratized or...
Yes, too much formalization. For example, when you look at the numbers in Cuba right now, almost 70% of the professional and technical labor force are women. And it's a tremendous achievement. In the Cuban parliament, around 43-45% are women. In Cuba, women and childhood are very well protected. I mean, it's incredible the amount of laws and regulations protecting women. This thing of equal payment for equal job is something that is in the past because they have moved even beyond. But at the same time, the formalizing process of all that. I mean, when you have to deal with an institution and so on. I mean, the major problem is that institutions stopped representing people, and we started representing them. Mm-hmm. It was twisted. Mm-hmm. And suddenly there is a huge organization for women, but Cuban women are supposed to represent this organization and respond to it, not the other way.
So it became backwards.
Yes.
Representative institutions became almost dictatorial institutions.
It was a very bureaucratic mindset established. Yeah. And for example, in the 90s, because we suffered a huge crisis in the 90s with the falling of the Soviet bloc and so on. And first of all, Cuba lost in an overnight, in 1 year, 85% of imports and 75% of foreign trade. It's huge. If that happened in Germany, they all commit suicide. I don't know if that happened here, but it happened in Cuba. And at the same time, in the 90s, the US government said, well, okay, this is the time, hit them when they are down. This is the time to crush the revolution. So there were a number of resolutions and bills and so on approved here to simply...
Helms-Burton Act and things like that.
Yes, in 1992 was the Torricelli bill. And according to the Torricelli bill from 92, any ship, any container ship, if they went to Cuba first, they have to wait 6 months to come here. So try to imagine what is the volume of market of Cuba.
Wasn't this also the time when the re-export of pharmaceuticals? In other words, before then, you couldn't export pharmaceuticals from the United States to Cuba, but you could export them to Europe, and then they could go to Cuba.
Yeah.
But at that point, that was stopped also.
Completely. And in 1986, the Helms-Burton bill had two major things. First, it started punishing foreign firms trading with Cuba. And also, it handcuffed the president of the US in order to lift the embargo. So everybody today is asking why Obama hasn't lifted the embargo. He cannot do it. He can't. It had to go through a bicameral discussion and approval. And on the other hand, the embargo is not a switch. I mean, nobody can switch off. It's a huge complex of resolutions and laws preventing any kind of trading. Under the Obama administration is when the penalties for trading with Cuba has been the worst for foreign banks. We're talking about billions, 25.
So the penalties have been the worst under Obama.
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, first of all, it's a good business. You trade with Cuba, I fine you for $25 billion. It's a good business. Don't deal.
No, that can't be a reason now. Come on.
I don't know exactly. The thing is, let's destroy the government. Let's make the government look failed and incompetent. And then everything will be fine. Actually, if we read carefully, and I consider Obama one of the brightest politicians in this country and in the world. I consider him very, very bright person. And he's an honest politician, by the way. But if we read carefully his speech, he said, we have been trying to do things in one way to defeat these people. So we should not be doing the same. We should do something different, but the purpose is the same. We need to get rid of them. Now what we're going to do is to stimulate the private sector and undermine the authority of Cuban government and so on. But the idea is
So your interpretation of the opening of the Obama administration to Cuba is this is an attempt to undermine the revolution by other means?
Is one of the side effects, in my opinion. because finally, for one time, for first time in many years, there is a smart person saying, well, this is not the way of doing things, you know. And I really appreciate what happened. On the other hand, I have to say, I mean, in order of the truth, everybody, I mean, there is a trend or stereotype saying that was the thing of Obama. It was two guys thing. It was Obama and Raul Castro both together. I guess that they both had to overcome a lot of forces in order to change things, but both of them. It's not just Obama, the one who made it possible. I guess Raul Castro was smart enough and did the right things. There is an interesting book, The Back Channel Between Cuba and the U.S., that had a lot of information about all the negotiations between Cuba and the U.S. All over the years. And the thing is that always when they became public, always there was someone or some organization destroying everything. This is the first time in 60 years of history that no one knew anything, and the secrecy was good enough to take a step forward.
So, in other words, you're saying it's not the major intent of the Obama administration to undermine the revolution, but it could be one of the side effects of this open.
Of course.
Okay, so now we have to decide what we want to do, okay? And if the problem is a lack of popular participation in the Cuban Revolution, then we have to have popular participation here, right? So the question is, do we want to have some Q&A now, and then come back and we'll finish with a discussion of the contemporary period, or do you want us to discuss the contemporary period and then we'll open the floor? Well, you're not used to this, are you? What's that? You'd vote for the latter? Okay. Is that okay? We'll go another 10 minutes. We'll come up to the present. And where's Katie? You got the microphone, Katie? Okay, so when we're ready, okay. That's popular participation.
Yeah.
One person. One wise woman right there. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what's happened in the, am I on, Katie? Did I just do, I'm on? Okay, good enough. It's not just in the last 2 years, but the last 10 or 15 years as a result of the so-called special period in time of peace, which is what Fidel Castro called the crisis of the 1990s. And it was a severe crisis in Cuba. It was a collapse of the economy greater than what we faced during the Great Depression here. It's very hard to, I think, for most people to get a sense of how difficult things were. And they were extraordinarily difficult. The special period in time of peace. As a result of that, the revolution made concessions. It changed certain laws. It welcomed prostitution. Well, it didn't welcome prostitution. It welcomed tourism. And with that comes certain social ills. The dollar began to circulate in Cuba. And some of the regulations on remittances changed a bit. And as a result of this, and now as I understand it, inequality is rising again in Cuba, and it's changing Cuba in certain ways. Could we talk about that for a few minutes?
Definitely. I mean, economic crisis, any economic crisis in any part of the world, changes the spirit of the society and makes appear the worst part of the humankind. So it also happened in Cuba in a certain way. I have to say that in the middle of the worst part of the crisis, no school was closed, no hospital was closed, no protection for women and child was cut off. And that's something, I mean, that's quite important. The major achievements of the revolution were protected. And it was a constant thing, you know. And also that something I think it's in the Cuban nature to practice solidarity and be helping everybody. We're so like open. But the revolution actually made that grow and made that fundamental. Otherwise, we cannot understand these people fighting Ebola in Africa for nothing in return.
Can't understand. Do that again?
Yeah, without understanding this spirit of solidarity in the revolution, we cannot understand these people fighting Ebola in Africa.
Okay.
So that spirit of solidarity
So this is the
kept on
Cuban
going.
doctors who
Yes.
gone
And people try to survive the crisis and by helping the others, by helping each other and sharing what we have. Because this is what we learned. But again, the boring part of the revolution, we're sat down behind a desk and thinking for the rest of the people. So 1994, we were touching button, and the government decided to approve certain reforms, which, by the way, everybody agreed in the point that we needed some reforms. We need to change things. Actually, the will in the way we knew it didn't exist anymore. I remember I had a friend at that time. She loved tattoos, and she told me one day, Humberto, I'm painting in my body countries that don't exist anymore, like Atlantida, like the lowlands of Trollking, and the Soviet Union. Yeah, it doesn't exist anymore. And
I would ask you why she would do that, but I'm going to let that one go.
And the thing is that people started understanding what was happening, and we are talking about it, people with a tremendous level of education, with a tremendous level of instruction, a huge percentage. Actually, we're confronting a big problem today because the proportion of people with university degrees is over what we need in society. So people are prepared to think and be resourceful. But then the government decided to go, for example, to allow dollars to circulate in the Cuban economy. I, at that time, was working already in certain things, and I was completely opposed to that because there was no need. You can promote tourism, foreign investments, and whatever. But people, you just devaluate your currency and make it circulate in your economy. Because dollar is your money, but once it's inside one economy, there is no way to get rid of it. Look Ecuador, and look Panama, and so on. I mean, the cases were there. But someone said, well, this is the easiest way to capture fresh currency,
Yeah.
hard currency. Actually, I mean, in order to make a balance, Cuba doesn't have access to foreign credits. We are not part of the IMF or World Bank. Thank God, by the way.
Yeah.
But we have no loans from any bank in the world. And actually, banks who deal with Cuba are punished. So it was a difficult situation.
Right.
So you need to attract foreign money, foreign investments. So there was a law for opening the investments and so on. And the foreign tourism. One problem is that those who decided that put Cubans away from tourism, even against the Cuban Constitution. And the reaction of the people was, we will find a third way of doing it. So at some point, there were millions of women educated. For example, in Cuba, women are owners of their own body. And this is quite important in terms of feminism and understanding anti-patriarchy. Women have to be in control of their body. Nobody have to tell you what to wear, what to do with your body. All that is out of the question in Cuba. So they're very independent. And they realized that they had a gorgeous body. They could do with their body what they wanted. And so they started. And there was a guy with short sight and without a knowledge about advertisement. And the first advertisement about the tourism in Cuba was a big poster with a gorgeous mulata in a tiny bikini. And behind you see the beach and the rum and the cigars and so on. But the first was that mulata.
Was this an advertisement?
In the 90s for Cuban tourism. So people started understanding the tourism as a sexual tourism in Cuba. And actually there was a huge campaign in order to sabotage the tourism in Cuba. Based on that, and it was a fact. And on the other hand, Cubans were marginalized from that. And they started being marginalized from many decision-making processes. So in the late 90s, the economic situation started changing a little bit. And then in 2006, Fidel Castro got sick. And for what it's worth, he's not in control of Cuba anymore. You know, he's sick, and that's it. Because, I mean, people used to say, he's the one behind the scene, pulling the strings. No, absolutely not. So Raúl Castro started a reform, and which, for one hand, it was good because it removed a lot of image things that had to be changed, and there was no need to. Is mine or what? Okay. I try to be like frozen. There were things like, for example, there was a migratory reform in Cuba that was very positive, because Cubans, we used to need to ask for permission to ask for an exit visa to travel abroad. And in 2011, the government said that's completely absurd, and they removed it. And
So Cubans can travel anywhere that they want?
no, because they need money for it, and they don't have it. And on the other hand, they need a visa, and they don't have it. Yes. Now it's not the government telling you you cannot. Oh, you can go whatever you want. There were like at some point someone smart enough to realize that because of the remittances from here, and also because Cuban participating in business abroad and making money and so on, they were a major source of tourism. So now Cuban tourism is bringing like $200 million.
Well, this, at least from what I've seen, the two growing sources of inequality are tourism and remittances.
No.
Well, the tourist economy, people who are active in the tourist economy are making much more money than everyday Cubans.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of remittances, since most of the wealthy families in South Florida are white, that as they remit money to their families in Havana, this is reinstating a racially based inequality in Havana.
I can't say that tourism and remittances are the cause of inequality. The real causes of inequality in Cuba today is the way the society is organized. First of all, those who make money in tourist industry. I learned from a guy, from a peasant working the land. He said, the major wealth, if it comes from your work, doesn't corrupt you, which is true. When you have to work for it, it doesn't matter how much money you make. It's your work behind it. So people in the tourist industry who are working so hard, they're doing fine. That's not the problem. The problem is that the society is so bureaucratized, so centralized, that suddenly decisions are made by people without the authority or power to do it. And then it creates a huge imbalance, you know. Give you an example. Cuba is sending doctors everywhere. Our soldiers now are dressing in white and healing people, not killing people. And in Brazil, there is like 1,000 doctors or maybe more in a plan that the Brazilian government established in order to take care of their poorest population. And actually, I have to say that the major source of revenues for Cuban economy is today these services we're giving. Thing is that suddenly doctors, they spend there like 3 years, 5 years. They wanted to be with their families, and they could afford that. And someone in the Ministry of Public Health said, no, that's wrong, and we don't want that. What happened is that there is a proposal from the U.S. Saying there's a parole plan encouraging the doctors, the Cuban doctors, just the Cuban doctors, to come here, defect, and automatically they get validation of their titles and so on, and they could do all the things. So these people there started, I mean, at the time they were so disappointed. They started doing things in another way, and they get the money accumulated and invested in another thing. They didn't want to be doctors. They just made money to have another business and so on, and it was a huge source of inequality. What is happening right now is an accumulation of wealth in few hands, in particularly in Havana. It's what I call the so-called white middle class, upper middle class in Havana. And since there is no control of anything, then it's easy to create these standards of inequalities. And on the other hand, unfortunately, I cannot talk about economists here, but I can talk about most of the economists there who were always servants of the politics, and they have to justify exactly what the politics says. And they ended up justifying source of inequalities and so on. For example, the ration card. In Cuba, there is a ration card since the 1960 because all the shortages and because of the embargo, the underdevelopment and so on. So the government implemented a ration card so people could have at least a certain amount of food and they don't starve. Rice, beans, coffee, whatever. Ration card.
Not Russian card.
And also Russian cards.
Yeah, Russian card, ration card.
It's Russian card. And even when a baby is just born, already had a ration card with coffee, whatever things that a kid don't take. But the thing is that at some point the ration card was a way to take care of inequalities, to keep some equal access to food and minimum access of, and complementing the access of the same equal opportunities for education, whatever. So there are people now in Cuba saying, we don't need that anymore. Those who are saying that, I remember in an article I published a couple of years ago, I used to say that the problems of our economy are because our economy depends on people who doesn't depend on the economy. And those are the ones making the major decisions.
Our economy depends on people who don't depend on the economy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's easy for them to say, well, we can't get rid of the ration card. We don't need it anymore. It's a weight for the government budget, you know. It's completely wrong. It used to keep people in the same level of opportunities, you know. Another thing that happened is that because of this dynamics of foreign investment and so on, there was a process of bleaching the positions in the management for foreign firms. What do I mean by that? White people. Black people were put in the dirty works, do the cleaning, whatever. There was a racial disparity that you see it in that sector specifically. People into management and whatever, is, the Yuppies are white. Mm-hmm. They were bleached. And it created a huge problem now. It's creating problems now. Also, it brought inequality for women, because then they were just assumed that, you have to have the gorgeous receptionist and the gorgeous blonde secretary and whatever,
Right.
It's the only way. And it objectified women again. And it started, everything what we had achieved started being put behind. The schools are still free and accessible for everybody. But I remember a personal story with my daughter. She studied in a very good school, and still you have to have exams, just exams. You don't have to pay anything, whatever. And it was a boarding school, and every weekend I have to go and pick her up at one point. And she just arrived and said, "Dad, can you wait and look at the buses?" And after a while, I said, "Well, we're running out of time. What do you want me to see?" She asked me, "How many black people you saw dropping down the bus?" So she said, "That's the future of our universities and our professionals." And then she made me think that when I studied in the university, we were like United Color of Benetton.
Right.
And right now, it had changed. So this is part of the challenges we're facing right now, because the reforms are good from one hand, but it has to be under control of the society. On the other hand, Cuba is facing the major challenge in demography and immigration and emigration.
Well, let's hold that,
Yeah.
because, and I'm gonna, if we have time, come back and ask you what hopes you have for the decentralization of the Cuban economy. But maybe we should go to some questions. Is it okay? Katie's got the mic. Sterl will come around. You got a tan and everything. You got two women right down here. Hey.
Hello. I wanted to ask about what policies there are for wealth distribution. You talked about how about the ration cards as they raise the standard for at least acquiring the basic needs like food. But what about the accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few? Do you have any policies for redistribution of wealth?
What was the first part of the question?
Like you do have policies that raise the standard of living a little, like you have ration cards. So you have some equal opportunity, but at the lower level. I was asking about when you talked about the accumulation of wealth in the hands of very few people. So do you have any distributive policies that would allow more equal distribution of wealth?
Right now, no. It's a big question mark, because the way it was done in the 70s and the 80s doesn't work anymore. First of all, Cuba doesn't have the influx of resources that we used to have before, and we still are an underdeveloped country, third world country, under the embargo. So it's difficult to maintain these levels of equalities, and even in the structures and in the way we used to have it before, like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. The thing is, again, for example, right now there is a tremendous discussion about ownership in Cuba. And I, particularly myself, I think that that is the wrong discussion. The thing is, who is going to be in control of what we have? How are we as society will have access to control all that? Because even we need to move from the notion of state-owned to public. Cubans, we don't have the notion of public property, public ownership. Because at some point there was a huge confusion between state ownership and social ownership. It is completely wrong, and we need to correct that. So as long as we don't do that, the levels of inequality and accumulation will grow.
Why don't you take a couple, Sterl?
More than one question, you say?
No, that was it.
Okay.
Well, let's take a couple.
I wanted to ask you to elaborate on a point that you began to talk about. I might be wrong about this, but Jose Marti in the 1800s made this declaration that there is no racism in Cuba, and then Castro adopted that as a part, kind of the anchor for his anti-discrimination policy. And but during the special period, Afro-Cubans said it's been special for us the whole time. So I just wondered, even if you talked about the rhetorical life of that declaration, it's still being made as U.S. citizens travel to Cuba, they're being told there's no, as a part of the national identity, sometimes there's no racism in Cuba. Could you address that in terms, not necessarily from the economic only standpoint, but from the discrimination standpoint directly?
Definitely. One thing I could say, there are no shootings against black people in Cuba, and that's fine. This is a sign. Say that there is discrimination. First of all, we lived for 400 years under slavery, discrimination. Even in 1958, Fulgencio Batista, who was the general, the guy with the coup, the guy from the Americans, and was the most powerful guy in Cuba. He tried to enter a country club, and he was expelled because he wasn't white. So take that into account. Too many years of that. 50 years of revolution, don't erase it. And on the other hand, still, for a long period in the revolution, prevailed prejudice. Not practices, but prejudice of racism. I am very revolutionary, but I don't want my girl to be married with a black guy. It's kind of the things that were growing at some point. In the middle of the crisis, when and we have to be on the economics, the major sector of poor population in Cuba are black. The major sector of marginal population in Cuba are black. They are non-white. The major population, the major sector of population on jail are black. And that is because something that has been happening in the island. It is funny for me when I listen to people in Cuba, officers from the government, sometimes bright intellectuals, but not subject to discrimination, saying that the revolution eradicated it. No. The revolution provided access, equal access to everybody, to jobs and political. Even there was established a policy of if there is several people for the same position, we must privilege women, black, and so on, and young. That was the policy. But once you establish that, it's because you are recognizing and inequality. And that was not the way to correct it. Right now in Cuba, there is a movement among the black people. First of all, making racism visible, because we need to visualize that. It has to move from private spaces to public spaces. We have to come up public and make it public. And on the other hand, and it's good that you asked that, I completely disagree with the term Afro-Cubans. In 1868, October 10th, when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes freed the slaves, since the very beginning that we started thinking as Cubans, black people were called Cubans. And as free Cubans, they could join the independence war. So since the very beginning as a nation, we incorporated everybody. We don't have Afro-Cubans. We have Cubans. We're all Cubans. Because on the other hand, we're so mixed. There's so much blood mixed in our DNA that you can't say, nobody could say. Actually, in Cuba, when someone started acting so like a picky, someone else comes and said, "Where is your grandma?" Because we're all mixed. So what part of the issue is that we need to come back to recognize ourselves as Cubans, another thing.
You didn't want to follow up? Okay.
We're going to take one more.
Thank you, Umberto. You speak about inequality in terms of a variety of different economic issues and social issues. How about equality or access to natural resources? Let it be forests or fish. And because I just wonder if that's all equal, or who are the people that are fishing in the waters? Is it people that are rich and people that have access to boats so that they could get the fish, or is it the poor people that can't? So I'm just curious as to access to natural resources and equality on that.
Well, first of all, I think that in terms of non-natural resources, in terms of dealing with the nature, we have so much to learn, you know, and in terms of legislation, all that. There still is very arbitrary in terms of people going and doing things, you know, by themselves. Even now that you mentioned Cubans fishing, it's interesting because Cubans are not allowed to take a boat. So I cannot say anything about that. It's actually it's under discussion, this thing. When the crews from Florida were planning to come to Cuba, there were Cubans in the cruise. They say no, they cannot come here because they cannot take a boat. So try to imagine for fishing. It's changing now. It is changing. And I guess it's part of the responsibilities we need to learn in terms, as a society, how to deal with that, because I'm sure, we're not completely conscious about it. There are sites where the government has implemented policies in order to protect natural resources, you know. But in the daily life, sometimes we're so anti-environmentalist, you know. For me, it's a everyday like a crush, because I have acquired in my life kind of environmental consciousness, you know. And when I see what I see is we need to learn too much about it. Yeah.
I want to just give you a chance to talk a little bit about, not a Cuban answer, but maybe an American answer. about what your hopes would be for preserving and developing the major accomplishments of the revolution. Is there a way to do that while dealing with this problem of bureaucracy and entrenched interest? Do you think that's a realistic hope for Cuba?
Well, maybe I got stuck in the 68 when they used to say, let's be rational, let's ask for the impossible.
Right.
So I'm trying to keep that rationality. But it's difficult. I mean, the challenges for Cuba are huge. Beginning, demographic and migratory. We're having a drain of people. Like 2016, it was around 70,000 young people leaving the island. And that's a huge number. And 20% of Cuban population is over 60 years old. So the trend is to grow. Young people in Cuba, they don't want to have kids because they don't know where they're going to have kids. And Heisenberg, the German physicist, would die of a heart attack in Cuba because this principle of uncertainty, it doesn't work in Cuba. I mean, we have a huge question mark about that. But I think that their forces, I see a lot of young people unhappy with the situation we have. But I see a lot of young people trying to change that inside the island. It's true that the option of many young guys is finish their studies in the university and leave the island and establish in some other place. But I see other people. There is a trend of, well, let's try to do something here. It's a major challenge because on the other hand, it is not happening just some bureaucrats we need to change, some demographic issues we need to correct or whatever. It's also the confrontation with the U.S. hasn't finished. I read the speech of Hillary Clinton about Cuba. She said, we need to lift embargo to finish with the government, to finish with the revolution. I mean, the confrontation, the image still is very confrontational. Not to talk about Trump. So it's a major challenge. But my hopes are in a new generations in Cuba who are smart, hard workers, committed with, because I have to trust in the education I gave to my children, you know, and I think my friends and my generation have to trust on that, you know. Part of the problem of the historic revolution is that they were not able to trust their children. But if I'm going to be better than them, I have to trust in my children. And I'm sure they will find a solution. They will find it. They have proof that youth always prove to have a solution in their hand, you know. And there are spaces being opened right now in the middle of the recession because many people are disappointed. And this is the worst part of the revolution today, you know. Being revolutionary means nothing for many people. And because it's associated with this bureaucratic mindset, this narrow mind people. But on the other hand, there are young people saying, well, this is my place. I want to change it and make it better. And I trust that. I support them all the way.
It's an old communist tradition that we clap for each other. I just wanted to remind you that on Wednesday, October 19th, 6 o'clock, over here in the Center for Biotechnology and Life Sciences, we have Maria Elena Castellanos Gonzalez talking about Cuba's coastal communities partnering to save Cienfuegos Bay. Please join us then, and thanks a lot for coming tonight.